Podcast number 4: The Cubana Air Disaster. On the morning of October 6, 1976, Cubana Airlines flight number 455 took off from the Sewell Airport in Barbados with 73 passengers on board heading for the island of Jamaica. 11 minutes after takeoff, the plane was ripped apart by two explosions that caused it to crash into the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea. All 73 passengers aboard that flight were killed. History would later record this event as the Cubana Air Disaster. Hi there, and welcome once again to Forgotten Stories with Aaron Darcy. I am your host, Aaron Darcy. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time as we explore some of the events that shaped the history of Guyana and the Caribbean. Today we look back at the Cubana Air Disaster of October 6, 1976. Cubana Airways Flight 455 was on its way from Barbados to Jamaica, but was brought down on October 6, 1976 by a terrorist bomb attack. All 73 people on board the Douglas DC-8 aircraft were killed after two time bombs went off and the plane crashed into the Caribbean Sea. The crash killed every member of the Cuban national fencing team and every other person on board. Among those killed were 11 Guyanese students on their way to study in Cuba, and this incident shook up the people of Guyana and brought them together in a way that disasters usually do. In the early 70s, Guyana had established diplomatic relations with Cuba, and so Cuban doctors were sent to Guyana to assist in the health system. Guyanese doctors had mostly fled the country by then. Guyanese students also had the opportunity to study medicine in Cuba as part of the diplomatic exchange. During the 70s and 80s, Guyanese people were in a constant state of tension and expectation. The shortage of basic food items like wheat flour, and many other consumer items had become quite normal. Power outages happened every day and every night and became so accepted that when the power went out, people would say, "The blackout, come on." The country had established a national service program and a people's militia, and citizens were constantly bombarded by announcements of imminent danger from Venezuela, which had a long-running claim to most of Guyana's territory. Mass games and other such activities were used by the government as props for their socialist agenda. In hindsight, it was no surprise that certain elements would consider Guyana a political target. The WPA had taken on the role of a fierce opposition party with rallies and meetings, creating growing political awareness among the populace, and the ruling party had its band of thugs that handed out beatings and death to those that would dare oppose its rule. The House of Israel was closely aligned with the ruling party, and the People's Temple of Jim Jones had firmly established itself inside the jungle of the northwest district of the country. With power outages and shortages of just about every consumer commodity becoming normal, those who could afford to leave departed the country. The people who could not afford tickets to a healthier lifestyle stayed, and this situation came to be known as cut and run or stay and bun. This then was the environment in which news of this terrible incident was broadcast to the people of Guyana and across the Caribbean. It sort of took the focus off of the everyday woes of the Guyanese people and gave them something else to be concerned about. Political complications quickly arose when Cuba accused the U.S. government of being complicit in the bombing. Subsequently, certain intelligence documents were made public in 2005, which suggested that at least one intelligence agency, quote, had concrete advance intelligence, as early as June 1976, of plans by Cuban exile terrorist groups to bomb a Cubana airliner. Unquote. On June 11, 1976, a group called Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations was founded in the Dominican Republic by Cuban exiles. This organization united 5 anti-Castro groups, and for 3 months before the bombing of Flight 455, they waged a campaign of violence against several Caribbean countries which had established links with Cuba. Former anti-Castro militant Luis Posada Carriles was a founder of this group, which is believed to have been responsible for the bombing. Carriles denied involvement in the bombing of Flight 455, but would later provide many details of the incident in his book Caminos del Guerrero, Ways of the Warrior. In July 1976, the same Cubana Flight 455 was targeted in Jamaica by a suitcase bomb which exploded just before being loaded onto the plane. Other bombings in the summer were carried out at a number of airline offices that did business with Cuba, including the offices of BWIA in Barbados, Air Panama in Colombia, and Iberia and Nanaco Line in Costa Rica. Other attacks included the murder of a Cuban official in Mexico and 2 more Cuban officials in Argentina, the September assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C., and a mysterious fire in Guyana, which destroyed a large quantity of Cuban-supplied fishing equipment. Several anti-Castro Cuban exiles, among them Rafael de Jesus Gutierrez, a Cuban intelligence officer of the former Batista regime, were also implicated in the destruction of Cubana Flight 455. It was obvious that a campaign of terrorism was being conducted in the Caribbean, mostly against Cuba and the countries that were friendly with Cuba. Hours after the explosions on Flight 455, Trinidadian authorities arrested Freddy Lugo and Hernan Ricardo Lozano, two Venezuelan men who had boarded the plane in Trinidad and checked their baggage to Cuba. However, these two left the plane in Barbados and flew separately to Trinidad to avoid suspicion. Lozano had been traveling with fake ID under the name of José Vázquez Garcia. Lugo and Lozano later confessed, and declared they were acting under the orders of Luis Posada Carriles, the anti-Castro militant. Their testimony, along with other evidence, implicated Posada and Orlando Bosch, an anti-Castro Cuban living in Venezuela. On the 14th of October 1976, Posada and Bosch were arrested in Venezuela. On the 20th of October, authorities of Trinidad, Cuba, Barbados, Guyana and Venezuela held a meeting in Port of Spain, during which it was decided to hold the trial in Venezuela, since the four accused were citizens of that country. Shortly after, Lugo and Lozano were deported to Venezuela. Luis Posada Carriles was held for 8 years while awaiting a final sentence but eventually fled. He later entered the United States, where he was held on charges of entering the country illegally, but was released in April 2007. Freddy Lugo and Hernan Ricardo Lozano were each sentenced to 20-year prison terms. Orlando Bosch was acquitted and later moved to Miami, Florida, where he lived until his death in April 2011. The Cubana air disaster was memorialized by the Guyana government with monuments and was used to promote even more socialist propaganda and to drive more fear into Guyanese people. But this is not to say that this was the only result of the incident, for many Guyanese families had suffered personal losses and were in deep mourning. For the greater part, Guyanese were indeed further brainwashed and felt even more isolated and threatened, which played handsomely into the politics of the time. This incident has probably faded from the memory of most Guyanese and Caribbean people, but remains an indelible part of our history. Incidents like this one serve to bring us closer together and to remind us of our common heritage, and despite the many differences in our racial and cultural roots, we should continue to explore and celebrate our similarities. I do look forward to sharing much more with you on Forgotten Stories of Guyana and the Caribbean with Aaron Darcy. So join me on the next episode as we continue to travel back in time and to explore our history and heritage. Goodbye for now.